Very much, Murakami Sensei, for inviting me here today. And I thank also my good friend, Kurokawa Sensei, for being on the line as a commentator and for also being instrumental in inviting me to join this very excellent dialogue. As I was recently in Japan for my first visit in 3 years, thanks to the pandemic, it feels disappointing that I couldn't do this while live to be with you and discuss with you actually in Japan. But I'm delighted now to have the opportunity to do it online from my house in Ireland. I split my time between the UK and Ireland. My title is very broad: Global Pandemic, Russia's War and China's Rise, Japan's Challenges. And the reason it is so broad is because I think Japan's challenges are very broad. The fact is that the world has been passing through a series of both massive shocks, but also difficult long-term trends that are all putting an enormous pressure on all countries in the world, but including very much Japan. And we all, as countries, need to respond to them, understanding both our strengths and our weaknesses. These shocks can be dated back quite a long time, really, more than the past 10 years. If we start with the 2008 global financial crisis, which centered in the United States and Europe, but affected the world. We then, of course, moved through 2011, when the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident at Fukushima Daiichi shocked the world, but shocked Japan and shook up a lot of assumptions about Japanese regulatory and energy system. In 2014, we saw Russia seize Crimea and intervene militarily in Ukraine, beginning what Ukrainians now understand to have been a long war on Ukraine that the rest of the world has only just woken up to the magnitude of. But that really was the beginning of the violation of the United Nations Charter of 1945 by one of the signatories, by one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, changing territorial borders by force against the provisions of the United Nations Charter. In 2016, we saw Donald Trump elected as President of the United States. Not a shock in itself. American presidents always come from a very wide range of backgrounds. Sometimes they come from almost nowhere as far as international awareness is concerned. But he was a shock because, as America's president, he then mounted an attack on multilateral organizations, both in defense and security, like NATO, and some of the alliance structures in East Asia, including Japan, with a lot of pressure on Japan over the status of forces agreement and the cost of the bases, but very much on the trading system. The World Trade Organization attacked multilateral institutions, took tariff action against Japan and Europe over steel and aluminium, and therefore violated a basic assumption about the previous half century, which was that America was, on balance, a force for free trade, but also a supporter of multilateral institutions as a way to regulate world affairs and build up steadily a rules-based order. And then, of course, in 2020 began the coronavirus pandemic, which shocked all countries, caused closings of borders, caused massive disruption, actually much less so in Japan than in most other advanced countries, including both the UK and Ireland, but nevertheless challenged, I think, the health and science institutions of Japan. And then finally, we have the war of 2022, starting on February the 24th, Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighboring country, Ukraine, the killing of tens of thousands of people, all of which had been prefaced by, on February the 4th in Beijing, the publication of a new Russia-China security partnership, which showed that or displayed the idea that that Russia and China were in a partnership which, as the leaders said, knows no limits, that was a direct challenge to domination of world affairs by the broadly defined West, the G7, including Japan, that purported to defend multilateral institutions, but clearly defined a separate room for maneuver and behavior to superpowers, which include, of course, China and Russia, that the rules-based order is for everyone else, but the superpowers can and will act on their own, opening up new questions about how China might behave in the future in East Asia. So this series of shocks have challenged all countries in the world, particularly in Europe, thanks to the direct exposure to the war in Ukraine, but very much so also surrounding Japan. There is a general point about all of these shocks that I think we need to accept and to understand. And that general point is that while we spend a lot of time talking about predictions, talking about forecasts, making discussions about global trends, discussions about where the world is going to be in 2030 or 2040 or 2050, what these shocks tell us and remind us is that actually we are not in a predictable world. We are in a world of radical uncertainty, a world in which many things, shocks, are predicted as being potential issues that can happen, but it is completely unpredictable when they will happen and what their consequences might be. The pandemic was the classic case of this. Many people had forecast that there would be, at some point, a global pandemic, probably even including coronavirus type viruses, but nobody knew when, nobody knew how, nobody knew what kind of consequences it might have. Among those who predicted it were Bill Gates and many others. Many countries made preparations. Many countries have included pandemics as among the risks in their national intelligence evaluations and in their recommendations to government that preparations should be made. But in practice, when the pandemic actually happened, beginning in February 2020, and we became aware of it, most of those preparations proved ineffective or even, in many cases, useless, because it was impossible to prepare for such a wide range of potential disasters, potential actions. I think what this series of shocks, financial, geopolitical, natural, and now health, must teach us, and must teach every country, but that includes very much Japan, is that prediction and preparation are not in themselves very useful. They may be necessary, but they're not sufficient. The key issue and the key challenge for all countries, and I think, as I will come on to explain, that is a particular challenge for Japan, is to develop a learning ability, an ability to learn from the challenge that's coming and adapt quickly to that challenge through whether social change, political change, technological change, commercial change. At any rate, that kind of adaptability is critical for companies, it's critical for organizations, but also it's critical for government and a whole society. Building resilience is important too, the capability to absorb shocks, but most important learning or lesson from this is that the ability to adapt, to change your ways quickly is vital. And I'm emphasizing that because I think in the case of the pandemic, as I'll come on to explain, Japan was brilliant in terms of resilience, brilliant in terms of response and identification, but not so good in terms of learning ability and adaptation to the crisis in health terms. And that is something that I think is a challenge to try to improve for the future. Let me, before focusing on the pandemic for a moment, let me just look at what impact has there been on Japan and its challenges, its sense of strengths and weaknesses from all of these shocks that we've seen in the past decade, because the impact is cumulative. The first impact, the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, was an impact of weakening and politically weakening, especially the Western allies, the G7 allies in Europe and the United States, which are the cornerstone of Japan's foreign and security policy. Those allies lost credibility and some legitimacy thanks to the shock, the crisis that had happened. They became more politically unstable, but also they have become somewhat less effective in global affairs. So that was the legacy of 2008, which of course led to political shocks such as Brexit, Britain's departure from the European Union, and some of the consequences of the election of Donald Trump, a relatively extreme figure in American politics. That changes the alliance network on which Japan has depended. The impact of 3/11, of the tsunami and Fukushima, is something that you are all far better aware of than I am, but the key legacy for now that I would underline is the impact on Japan's energy security and the impact that the legacy that it's had in making it very difficult for Japan to establish greater energy independence, but also to be able to get back on a path towards decarbonization and net zero. And secondly, the aspect that Kurokawa sensei has been such a leading voice on, namely a challenge to the Japanese conduct of the state and the way in which state institutions had operated. The third shock, I've already outlined the effect, the importance of the policies of the Trump administration regard to multilateral institutions on which Japan has depended for its stable commercial, foreign and security policy conduct in world affairs, a challenge by the founder of the rules-based order of that very order, which I think showed that the United States has become more unpredictable in its politics and its stability, less dependable, even as it is nevertheless indispensable. So we have the paradox during the Trump administration that Japan and Prime Minister Abe were in some ways the most successful country in managing their relationship with the Trump administration, most successful in establishing a close relationship with Mr. Trump personally, and yet actually his conduct challenged many of the assumptions that Japan had based its policy on, most fundamentally, and therefore simultaneous to that closeness that Prime Minister Abe established, he also realized the need to build other networks and other friendships, other alliances within, especially Asia Pacific, and I believe successfully and actually brilliantly re-established the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Trade, renamed as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, as a rules-based order outside American influence, but very much under strong influence of Japan. So it's the paradox that under Trump, Japan correctly got closer to Trump, but also built its own independent network and sense of autonomy within Asia. And then the pandemic, as I've outlined, as an outsider, I think the pandemic showed Japan's very fundamental strengths. Its social strengths in terms of societal responses. It showed strengths of the health system, not the hospital health system, but rather the public health nurse system, community nurses, the ability to spot outbreaks of coronavirus very quickly, to isolate them, to detect clusters of infection much more quickly than like the very centralized systems that were in operation in most European countries, for example. And I think a great success in Japan's response to the pandemic was the care of the elderly, the success in preventing a large death rate among elderly and vulnerable populations, which in European countries and the United States was the biggest and most damaging impact of the pandemic. Japan, despite having the oldest age structure of any of the G7 countries, nevertheless had the lowest mortality rate due to COVID among the elderly population of any country, and that is because of the strength of your systems in protecting the elderly. And those were, I think, magnificent achievements during the pandemic. But there were also weaknesses that I think I would isolate, that things that Japanese government and Japanese institutions should be thinking about in terms of planning for the learning ability and the adaptation ability that's necessary for future pandemics. Japan's biggest failure was that it was unable to develop successful vaccines or successful treatments against coronavirus, and therefore was entirely dependent on imports of those vaccines and treatments, and therefore was relatively late in receiving those imported advanced products from Europe and the United States, and was pretty slow at approving them, at testing them, at approving them, and then implementing them, which I think pushed Japan to a position of being unnecessarily 2 or 3 months behind at every stage the rest of the world, which has exacerbated some of the economic impact of the pandemic. And this reflected, I think, the continued weaknesses of the workings of the Japanese state, of the bureaucracy, the silo mentality, the rigidity of much of it, very much along the same lines that Kurokawa Sensei's report on Fukushima Daiichi exposed, both in politics and in bureaucracy those years ago. The war in Ukraine, finally, well, not quite finally, but the war and China's rise, what have those exposed about Japan's challenges and about the necessary actions for the future? This is a war, an invasion in Europe, not close to Japan, but it has nevertheless, I think, acted as something of a wake-up call for the vulnerabilities that can be seen across many different fields in defense and security. Vulnerabilities in technology, particularly in cybersecurity. Vulnerabilities or weaknesses in your intelligence network, with the invasion having shown the vital importance of having a strong intelligence network. Japan is behind in developing its own sources of intelligence, its own intelligence management system. It has, of course, exposed weaknesses in defense capability that are a legacy of history and of the past. And why is that defense capability so important? Because also the war has raised important questions about America's reliability in deterrence of the invasion of other countries by nuclear-armed neighbors, particularly China, in the case of Taiwan, of course, but also of any other countries, or indeed of islands that China might potentially decide were important strategically for it, and of course North Korea. The US remains essential in deterrence, but the question that the war has highlighted is how reliable can America be, and therefore what further deterrence a country like Japan needs to build up to supplement America's position. I think also the outcome of the war has challenged a lot of assumptions, both in Japan and in other parts of the G7, are about who really, in the end, are our friends, or at least our close partners. India's stance, following 20 years of active Japanese diplomacy and investment in India, following more than a decade of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue initiated by Japan in 2006, after an intensification of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue over the past 2 years under President Biden and Prime Minister Suga and Kishida. India nevertheless has stood apart from the G7's position, has shown itself wishing to have an independent position, perhaps as a future superpower, but also as a country that has close relationships also with Russia and China. Indonesia has been less obviously part of, like, the Western network, the Japanese-led network in Southeast Asia than we might have hoped and expected before the war began. Really, within Southeast Asia, only Singapore has been a direct and full backer of sanctions, but even Singapore feels the need to, at the same time as it backs the sanctions, say that it supports China's membership of the CPTPP. So the war has raised the question for Japan of whether Japan has sufficient resilience. Does it have sufficient capacity of its own, particularly in intelligence, but also in conventional defense and security capabilities? Does it have sufficient agency in the sense of relationships, close, trusted relationships with other countries that can enable it to influence them, to come on its side at moments of stress? I think that has set an agenda for the next decade of Japanese diplomacy, of foreign affairs, but also very much of defense and security, to try to remedy some of these senses of vulnerability. Among that sense of vulnerability in looking at defense capacity and intelligence capacity is people, is personnel. Demographic pressures, declining population, combined with other issues, mean that recruiting personnel for expanded defense and intelligence capacities is not going to be easy, which also means that technology is going to play a vital role, but also the use of and development of human capital becomes not just a social issue, not just an economic issue, but also an issue of defense and security. And I will come on to that as a key challenge for Japan in a moment. Because surrounding all of this has been China's rise, which is a long-term trend of the sort that has been both predictable and predicted. And that rise has brought for Japan a great, powerful sense of integration economically, in which issues of how dependent Japan might become economically or in the future technologically on China has risen steadily over time as an important challenge, an important issue. Germany today is grappling with the legacy of 20 years of building up very high dependency on Russia for energy imports, and some dependency, or at least some use of Russia as a market for many of its products, and now is suffering a great deal of anxiety as a result of that 20 years. Japan, I would say, in managing its economic integration with China, has been more successful in avoiding dependency and in managing a mixture of political tensions with the economic imperative of becoming a part of it, or using the opportunity of the world's second largest economy and growing market. Much more successful, starts from a much more stable position, but nevertheless in planning forward for the future and in thinking especially about issues of economic security, which principally must mean technology, technological independence, supply chain resilience, and protections against cybersecurity attacks and others. China's rise is absolutely central to the challenges that Japan has to meet and to plan for, prepare for, building that resilience and learning ability. Clearly, China's rise fundamentally has altered the way in which global governance institutions operate and work, because they are no longer led by a single dominant superpower as they've been since 1990 and the end of the Cold War. Now there's more than one big superpower that both want to manipulate global institutions but also act outside those global institutions. So a situation has emerged where you do have a rules-based order governing small and medium-sized countries, which a large country like Japan now has to be classified with the superpowers, China, Russia, and the United States, but in the future, or perhaps now in their perception, India, operate in their own independent way. And a big challenge for Japan is how it responds to that, protects itself in this environment when there are, in a way, 4 elephants trampling around and many other countries are in their paths. So where might this lead, and what must Japan do? Where it might lead, we know a lot less, of course, than we know about the past. We know what's happened in the past, but where it might lead is quite unpredictable. I think we only know a set of issues rather than a clear set of paths. We know that China actually is currently looking weak rather than strong, partly because of the zero COVID policy, which has led to its borders being closed, but also severe economic and social controls having been established, and also China has other economic questions, but that doesn't necessarily change the long-term perspective for China. We've seen the China-Russia strategic partnership signed, but we don't know quite where that's going to go. We know that China has been emphasizing during the war in Ukraine that this is not a military alliance. This is a partnership, not an alliance, but clearly for Japan, thinking about what to do and how to react in different scenarios in response to this evolving partnership between the 2 largest neighboring countries and greatest historical challenges has to be vital. Third, nuclear weapons have been put back on the table for the first time since the end of the Cold War, or even since longer. The overt threat of the use of a nuclear weapon in the war in Ukraine has, I think, been a deeply shocking phenomenon for all of us in Europe and in Asia. And therefore, questions about how to discuss controls on nuclear weapons have to be absolutely top of the agenda in future. I hope between the United States and China, above all, but also I think involving other deeply interested parties that include Japan, and how to build deterrence against any use of nuclear weapons, either by superpowers or by smaller countries such as North Korea. It puts on the table what will America look like over the next 10 years. America has been strong in response to the war in Ukraine, effective at building action among the G7, but is a politically divided country, is a country that has become politically unpredictable in the past decade. And we cannot know what America after President Biden will look like, nor indeed what its foreign policy will be. America very firmly is an indispensable ally, but also an unpredictable one. We are in a period of instability economically, with high inflation, with short-term, I hope, food crisis, thanks to the war in Ukraine, with a deep energy crisis. Managing that is, I think, an important challenge for every country, but very much for Japan. Japan has been hoping for inflation over the past 20 years. It has finally got inflation, but not of the sort that Governor Kuroda of the Bank of Japan has been hoping for, not wage-led inflation, but rather imported inflation. And managing that is not going to be easy. It's a mistake to think that globalization is dead, especially after a period when the global response of the pharmaceutical industry from Europe and America especially has been so magnificent in response to the pandemic. But globalization is going to evolve and change in response to the political pressures we're under. And in this new world, while we may not, I hope, have two clear camps between the West, including Japan on one side, and Russia and China on the other, nevertheless, we're going to have a series of fluctuating and floating alliances, as exemplified by the very large number of different groupings, the Quad, the BRICS summit, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping, and others, China's own global security initiative. We're going to have a confusing array of different combinations. So what must Japan do very briskly? One is, as I've said, build learning ability, attack rigidities, attack silo mentality, do everything that can be done in order to make systems, organizations more adaptable in the face of shocks and new developments. Because naturally, all countries have become complacent in an era of peace and seemingly in an absence of shocks in the 1990s and early 2000s. And now we all have to address our vulnerabilities. And I think that is the key agenda for Japan now. Building also the strategic agency through organizations like the CPTPP and other multilateral groups that bring together like-minded countries within East Asia and across the world, I think is a key issue. But the fundamental and final issue that I'm going to emphasize concerns the economic weakness that Japan has long suffered, which make it harder for Japan to face up to these challenges, harder to afford the building up of stronger defense or stronger intelligence or new health initiatives, because the economic weakness that has been driven by relatively low household incomes. And I think a big component of that is, as Murakami Sensei outlined, Japan's not enough female past and the poor use of human capital, particularly of women, through the many barriers that women have faced, but also through the divided labor market that has led to so many people on non-regular short-term work, which means a lack of training and a great insecurity in their lives. That especially affects women, and I think the release of the energies and capacities of Japanese women is going to be crucial for Japan to be able to react to the challenges that it faces over the next 20 years. So when I wrote in my book that Japan's far more female future, this was substantially hope and recommendation as much as prediction. Japan will have a more female future. The question is, will it be enough? And that's what I want to see and see achieved over the next 10 to 20 years. Thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Bill-san. It was very comprehensive, and so many points that you pointed out was very, very critical point that Japan really needs to think about it. And please, everyone, post your question if you'd like to ask a question on the Q&A box. Okay, so let me ask the first question to Bill-san. some years ago, Dr. Kurokawa and I wrote an op-ed about, Japan is finally changing after Fukushima, incident. And we're hoping that things will change because we have seen such a great shock, to the society and governance and everything. But we haven't really seen the big change. And as you pointed out, that Japan has so many issues that even we had this, America has changing, although, before this pandemic and this Russia's war, the US has been changing a lot. And as you said, it's very unpredictable. And also we have this pandemic and we have this Russia's war, and everything is so shaken, the Japan's foundation, that every policy was based upon. So I heard that you've been to Japan quite recently, and then you talked to many of experts and Japanese people here. And then have you seen any signs of those people you talked, maybe, the leaders or the bureaucrats, leaders, and then because unless they recognize the importance of change, we cannot expect any big change. So what is your take? What is your review on that?
First of all, perhaps what's the answer to the question, why is change so difficult? And I think the answer always is in all countries that even if theoretically there may be an acceptance that there is a case for change, there are just a lot of powerful interests in business, in parts of the government, in politics, in society, that resist that change, because even if they accept the idea theoretically, in practice, once it comes down to it, they prefer their way of doing things, the old way of doing things, the things that serve their interests. And I think that that's the story of the Japanese system post 3/11. So many powerful interests pushed against many of the changes that you and Kurokawa sensei recommended. Despite the magnitude of the shock, nevertheless, the power of those interests proved huge. So in coming for my 10-day look, which is only a snapshot, of course, I suppose the question recently is, well, is the defense and security shock of the invasion of Ukraine and like the kind of crystallization of changes in global affairs, is that a sufficient shock to force change of any kind? I think it is, but only in the defense and security field. I think in defense and security, the forces in favor of change were already quite powerful politically before these shocks. They were already personified by Shinzo Abe himself, but also by many elements in the Liberal Democratic Party. There are business interests pushing in that direction. There are other interests pushing in the direction of a stronger defense and security, so that this has helped to reinforce those existing power. And I think that the vested interests against it will not be very powerful. So yes, I think probably something has shifted quite substantially in acceptance of a big increase in attention to defense and security, especially in technology and intelligence, as well as in mainstream capacity. So I think that is a change, but is it reflected elsewhere in judgments about the economy, about gender equality, about the way in which the system works, the way in which ministries work? I think not. I think there's much more, there's continuity there, and continued resistance and continued occupation of traditional ways of doing things. So but Japan always changes gradually and not rapidly. So what I've always spent my 4 decades looking for is never rapid change, but rather step-by-step change and to try to see how powerful the steps are and where they might lead is, I think, been the basic challenge in trying to gauge the mood of change.
Okay, thank you. So, and then also you talked about the rigidity, bureaucratic rigidity, and there's maybe this vested interest group not wanting change. So could you elaborate on details of rigidity, which you mentioned? It's from the audience.
Well, I think, the two best examples of rigidity in recent time has been rigidity in the evaluation of vaccines and treatments, where even though the world and Japan as well were in a state of emergency related to the coronavirus vaccine, there was really no response by the bureaucratic system to that state of emergency in the form of accelerating processes or entering into more trusted partnerships with other countries' regulatory agencies to try to accelerate those processes, but rather the established and agreed process needed to be followed more or less as it was. And so I think that's one sort of rigidity that I see. Perhaps a personal observation about rigidity can be the rigidity in the current visa system that is used to put a limit on the number of visitors coming to Japan. I was disappointed when I started to look into how could I get permission to come to visit Japan for the first time in 3 years, to find that the visa system that had been used was not a visa system tailored to the conditions of a pandemic, a system that required you to either provide, as it were, a sense of justification of the importance of your visit and also your health background that you were low risk. Rather, it's a visa system that presumably the Ministry of Health and Welfare, Health, Labour and Welfare, or another ministry had used, which is absolutely the same visa system has been used for other visa countries in the past, which had nothing to do with health and everything to do with finances, whether you were able to afford to pay your hotel bill while you were in Tokyo. So I was supposed to provide 3 months worth of bank statements or a letter of guarantee from an employer that my costs could be covered. So this was a totally irrelevant requirement to the need, nothing to do with COVID, but what it showed was a bureaucratic system which was unable to invent a new system of visa application because it was too rigid in its thinking. Its response to uncertainty was to stay where it was, and therefore just imported an old system and applied it to previously visa-exempt countries, which perhaps achieved the goal of restricting the numbers, but it showed a rigidity in the bureaucratic mindset, I would say. So those are just two small examples, but that's what I'm thinking of.
We have many questions, so let's go to the next question. This is from audience. I fully agree that interests in different groups are resisting the changes. However, I will always question why there's no Japanese civil society movement that can push and support the change in the society. What is your take on this?
Well, yes, I agree that more pressure should come from civil society. Sometimes civil society is also pushes, however, in a conservative direction. There are cases where civil society have been powerful, especially over nuclear energy, and that I think the fact that only 9 nuclear reactors are now operating 10 years after 3/11 is a consequence of the pressure from civil society. So civil society can operate. I would say that also missing is the media as a pressure for change. The media is, Japanese media is a force for policy thinking and policy advocacy, but not generally for change, for policy advocacy of a radical sort. The media tends to align with the established way of doing things and offer incremental recommendations for change, is my understanding. So I'd say media plus civil society is what has been somewhat weaker than it needs to be.
Okay, so we have next question from Beta. You mentioned that ability to adapt and learning inability is very important. I think that I totally agree, but it's really difficult to build that skill. Given that, same institution, education, going to college and hiring to the companies, and how the social norm is set, how, people have incentive to work and behave. So how do you build this ability to learn on a systematic level that you recommend?
Well, I think clearly that's a very difficult thing to a question to answer. I think it does require leadership from the top. I do think that political leaders and the current generation leading organizations, whether they are universities or companies or ministries, is really where the drive for that change needs to be pushed from, which probably means politics, number one, because they are responsible, but also they perhaps have the least to lose by demanding that kind of a systemic change. So if you said, what's your recommendation for how to do it? I would want to train and motivate and incentivize politicians to exercise leadership in forcing that kind of change in all the organizations that react to them. And as I say, which include universities, as well as companies and especially ministries, because if change comes in a company, it really has to be driven from the top, from the executive suite. And one of the difficulties of Japanese companies is the rotation of leadership, which then reduces the incentive to initiate substantive change from the current generation who happen to be chairman and chief executive. And it's when you have a longer term chairman and chief executive that you get the chance of forcing that systemic change. So I would hope that it can be trained in among political leaders to press for it and force for it. I do think the initiative for a digital agency that was being led by Prime Minister Suga and Minister Kono were the beginnings of some drive for that change. I'm worried that that drive may now, a year later, have weakened.
Okay, speaking of corporations, here's another question. What would be the key next step for Japanese companies to creating a gender inclusive workforce? Recently, the government has announced that they will be disclosing the pay gap, gender pay gap of corporation above 300 employees. And that would maybe trigger something, but just the corporate, as you said, the leaders changing cycle. So therefore, it has been said that it's necessary, but we haven't really seen any changes for inclusive workforce. So what do you think the next steps for the corporate?
Well, I think for Japanese companies, I think there are three big things. One, many companies have already done, but not all, which is to abolish the kind of two-track system, the fast track and administrative track system, which has biased very strongly against female staff. It classifies you and your abilities and ambitions at your point of entry to the company and freezes your potential. So I think abolishing that is number one. Many companies have already done this, but others need to do so. Second, human resources departments, and therefore the leadership of the company, should pay a special attention to development and training plans for talented female staff, which means building in to their development plan the assumption that some of them will leave to have children, but then come back, and how they should build their skills and knowledge of the company. That means tailoring the human resources planning to a modern life in which your staff are not all men and not all accruing their skills and their experience in the same way. And I think it's not discrimination. It's basically a realization that different people need different approaches, and that then I think would lead to a greater success of talented, skilled, experienced female professionals rising to the top management, top executive levels after 10, 20, 30 years. And I think that's vital. I think then the third factor for companies is to do with the sort of attitudes of seniors and attitudes not just to women, but to diversity in general. And so I think driving from the top again needs to alter this, because if gender inclusiveness is just something that is delegated way down into the company, then it's unlikely really to have a strong effect in the whole organization. It absolutely needs to be forced to be accepted at executive committee level, and therefore driven by the chief executive and the team around them, and then the next generation, to say that that the achievement of this and success in this is going to be a key measure of the company over the next 10 to 15 years. And then change can start to happen more rapidly than has been the case.
Okay, we have a small time left. First, maybe the final question here. Suzuki-san, he said, I'd like to ask about Japan's constitution, especially Article 9. Seeing Russian invasion to Ukraine, more and more Japanese citizens feel that we have to amend Article 9 to compare to China. Do you think that amendment would help Japan to strengthen the national security in practical manner?
My view of Article 9 is that it is desirable to change Article 9. It seems it's a language and a notion that seems irrelevant to today's world, compared with the world of the 1940s and 1950s. And so I think it should change. I don't think, however, that it's the vital, that it's absolutely essential. I think that Japan could build its defense and security capacity without doing Article 9, without changing Article 9. But the fact is that to do so would symbolically be important in normalizing the role of the self-defense forces and the intelligence agency, start to remove any remaining stigma surrounding those forces, and force, I think, other countries, including China, to accept Japan as a normal neighbor with normal defense and security requirements that could be needed to be dealt with and responded to in a normal way. So I would favor the change, but I don't think it's going to be of itself transformational. The most important thing is building capacity. Okay, maybe one final question. So for the renewable international order, neutrality, equity, accountability, trust, decolonization, etc., would be necessary. What is your thought on Japan's role to contribute to those issues, as well as securing national, economical, and most importantly, human security its own? Well, I think first the most interesting word in your list, this interesting question, is neutrality. I do think that to have an international order based on rules, this order must not be of a world divided into camps, into groups, where you are either for one side or for the other side. So in that sense, neutrality has a meaning. However, I don't think a country can be neutral as to its values, neutral as to the issues that it considers important, neutral as to human rights and like the basic values of its society and its political system. So neutrality means not being firmly identified as exclusively in one camp or another, yes, but absolutely what Japan contributes by clearly standing for a certain set of values in every aspect of world affairs, whether they are science or technology or commerce or diplomacy. And so I think that by standing up clearly for its values and being a respected country in negotiations and in regional diplomacy, especially, but global diplomacy, contributing actively. Japan will build and is building a set of friendships and networks that serve to protect what exists of the international order and also act as an incentive on countries like China to cooperate with that.
Okay, so it's time for Dr. Kurokawa. Please.
Thank you. Let's see. It was good to see you again a few weeks ago in Tokyo, because you have been a sort of visiting faculty at the University of Tokyo. You used to work for University of Tokyo as one of the advisors. And I think we really share same issue and concerns in the Japan and the world affairs, and particularly after this Putin's sort of Ukraine issue. In fact, a few weeks ago, after we met, I think I was invited in the House of Representatives to report and do maybe 3-hour session on the Fukushima thing. So I just started my remark about what's happened in Ukraine. That means nuclear plants become a big liability. And what kind of thing we're going to and sort of have to do. And I mentioned this because you are House of Representatives, you are lawmakers. So you have to be responsible making certain look, and that you can do and you have to do. And at the end of this session, I think one member asking me a question of this certain things, and my answer was, I told you, you are a lawmaker. You have to work on this issue. Don't ask me. And I think there's no unexpected things. You know what may be expected to happen after Ukraine issue. So that's your job and your responsibility. Don't ask me. I think that is one of the weaknesses of Japanese system and governance. And I think I really sort of reviewing all the historical background of Japan and global affairs, and it's changing. And Japan has not really changed because up to 30 years ago, the economy was increasing, and always, just like you, Japan as #1. And that mindset hasn't changed since the end of World War and since the Cold War, and then digital transformation, and Windows 95 came, and Japan's system and mindset hasn't changed. And so that is a thing of fundamental thing, what happened in Japan. Because Japan was successful until maybe 1990. But so they just still stick on the same system and same. Once you are in Mitsubishi Bank, you remain Mitsubishi Bank. You cannot move to Sumitomo Bank, that kind of thing. So I think this is a big challenge. And I think I thought about with this session, maybe we had to do some dialogue and just publish certain key issues. Because in many speaking engagement, I think UK and Japan has a similar historical background, because we are only island nation with a substantial populations. And why there are so much difference between UK and Japan? That's a question I pose many Japanese leaders. Because in continental nations, there's always a history of big war. But the exception, island nation with rich population is only Japan and the UK. Why they are different? That's my question I raise quite often intellectual bodies in Japan. In the university, you think why they are different. So I think maybe after listening to you, I thought about some questionnaire or some of the session, maybe we might publish in English or certain things.
That's a good idea. And I think this, I was just deciding that, because this is the anniversary of the Iwakura mission that came to Europe, including substantially to the UK 150 years ago from Japan. And I was thinking of marking this by having an event for the Japan Society with all the living former UK ambassadors to Japan and asked them the question in their special fields: what could Japan learn from the UK today, and what can the UK learn from Japan in each field, and maybe have I think a useful discussion about the differences, but also what would a new Iwakura mission look like? Depending on which direction it went, we should probably send one to Japan from Britain.
I think I really quote Iwakura mission quite often as a background of sort of opening Japan, and what kind of, I think they did a great job. There's no question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I read this kind of report, and I always quote Iwakura mission. Such a great mission. And then Meiji Revolution became a very successful one, and all of a sudden become quite arrogant. And why is it? What is the difference between UK and Japan? These are only two island nations with certain success in the past. But what's the difference? Just let them. So I pose a question to many sort of students and also many bureaucrats. Just think, why?
Maybe you've given me an idea for a future book. Perhaps I better, as someone, we can talk about it. Perhaps since I have one foot on each island, in many ways, in the UK and Japan, maybe I should try to answer this question.
Sure, that'd be great. All right, stay in touch. Great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the audience for listening so patiently and sending in so many excellent questions. And thank you, Murakami Sensei, for hosting.
You, Bill-san. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Right.